In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. As Simeon takes Jesus in his arms, he gives thanks in this timeless hymn of praise, often known by its Latin translation, Nunc dimittis, now you are dismissing. Simeon says, "My eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the presence of all peoples, a light for revelation to the Gentiles, or to enlighten the nations, and for glory to your people Israel." In Greek, the word for nations and Gentiles is the same, ethnos. Simon speaks prophetically of the inclusion of all in God's community. We usually think of Pentecost as the jumping-off point for the Holy Spirit vaulting over human, tribal, ethnic boundaries and caste systems. But this is right at the beginning of Jesus' life, and the Holy Spirit, we're told, is already active. Everyone will be equally welcome, including people who don't share a common language or even begin with the same religion. The Gospel of Luke especially is very inclusive. Today, for instance, Anna speaks and is named, unusual for a woman. Luke is onto something in tracking the Holy Spirit in this way. The movement of God in human history, as in Luke's Gospel, is always towards greater inclusion and justice. Today, I think a primary, if not the primary, work of God in the world is the work of anti-racism. The House of Bishops Theology Committee report called Realizing Beloved Community powerfully examines the legacy of slavery in this country, the damage that white supremacy continues to do, the doctrine of discovery, whereby European settlers saw foreign lands as de facto empty and theirs for the taking. An immigrant like me has benefited enormously from white skin privilege. This doesn't mean that white immigrants don't work as hard as other immigrants, but doors opened in part for someone like me because of my skin color and my accent. Mentors appeared that I cannot be sure would have appeared as easily if I had been young and black, or with a different accent. As I know I have shared before from this pulpit, as I proudly presented my green card at JFK for the first time, an immigration officer said to me, "Welcome home." It's wonderful to hear that when you're an immigrant, but it took a different turn. "Welcome home," he said. "You're the kind of immigrant we want. Not like these people," and he waved dismissively at the multi-generational family of color ahead of me. I would guess from their dress and accent, Indian perhaps, Pakistani perhaps, Bangladeshi perhaps. Racism is everywhere, including the immigration system. Racism isn't only visible in the tragic death of Tyree Nichols or the struggle to pass the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. We know, at least I hope we're becoming increasingly aware, that racism impacts healthcare, education, housing, voting. Is there any racism-free zone in American society today? Wouldn't it be wonderful if the church could lead the way? Here's something Realizing Beloved Community doesn't say. The idea of Christian supremacy, manifest destiny, comes from its own origins. Anti-Semitism has been a huge sin of our Christian history, and the Jews have suffered as much or more than any other group in history, and that is appalling. But I think we need to recognize that the whole of scriptures, including the Hebrew scriptures, manifest a theology of a chosen people, which can easily be abused. We remember, after all, that when God leads the ancient Israelites to the promised land, there are people already there. Genesis tells us openly it is the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. Collectively, they are known as the Canaanite tribes. And of course, the land is called Canaan. All of these indigenous peoples are eventually displaced or slain by the ancient Israelites. My point is simply that a belief that some people are more chosen than others, have a closer relationship to God from birth than others, is embedded in many ancient religions. And it's a fine line always between celebrating a close relationship with a loving God and distorting that into more special than, more welcome than. And many religions, including ours, have crossed that line in terrible ways. Jesus himself apparently struggled with sectarianism, with ethnocentrism, with what we might call racism. In Matthew's gospel, we have this unflattering encounter with the Canaanite woman who begs Jesus to heal her daughter. And Jesus says, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, not you." The woman challenges his assumption, and Jesus grows from it. Jesus is already radical enough to speak to a woman, and a foreign woman at that, but she teaches him as she edges towards being seen and heard at the table of Hebrew privilege, represented in this case by Jesus. Surely the Matthean community included this story because they want us to overhear Jesus' own learning that God comes through the Hebrew people, but God is not their possession. As John the Baptist puts it, you remember, God is able from these stones to raise up children to Abraham. Our ancestral tree doesn't mean that God is in our pocket. Or as Jesus says to the woman of Samaria in John's Gospel, salvation is from the Jews, but the time is coming when God will do a new thing in spirit and in truth. And that is what Simeon prophetically understands. The beloved community is given a broader foundation, not only, but also. The church, the early church, picks up this thread of inclusion in Acts, in volume 2 of Luke's Gospel. The question before them, the early church, is, are non-Jews welcome in the Jesus movement as they are, or do they have to become Jewish first? In Acts 15, the Council of Jerusalem decides that the Gentiles are equally welcome, just as they are, in the new movement. It's a powerful moment in the early church as the apostles see what the Holy Spirit is doing and say, who are we to resist? I think we can say that the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, has an anti-racist agenda. I think we can say that the gospel is God's anti-racist manifesto. A manifesto, by dictionary definition, is a written statement declaring publicly the intentions, motives, or views of its issuer. I think God's intentions are clear enough in the Gospels that we can pattern our lives upon them. Anti-racism, then, is not an optional add-on to the gospel or an elective within the Christian life. It is embedded in the gospel. As Simeon takes Jesus in his arms, we too will receive Jesus in our hands. Yet it is not enough to take and eat. We are also called to pray, to learn like Jesus, and to act. Let no one say we cannot change the world. We can start close to home. Immigrants come to our block on Saturday afternoons at 3 o'clock The immigrants that we have seen on the news arriving at our southern borders, being bussed up here, part of our city shelter system. These folks come to our block, and we can bring clothing. We can bring food for our food basket, which is also distributed right here on Saturday afternoons. We can volunteer. We might think of this as Doing Justice 101. Doing Justice 201 might include advocacy, supporting other justice organizations with our time and our donations, writing letters, signing petitions, protesting peacefully, working to get out the vote. Any of these actions and hundreds of others redistribute resources and help in real ways. They participate in God's own anti-racist agenda. And this is exactly how our country will become more hospitable for all God's children. We can each do more justice. We can each help change the world. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.